This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
They are everywhere, high up in the canopy, down in the ground, and crawling in your homes. Insects live in just about every habitat on planet Earth. In terms of diversity, they are unrivaled, accounting for the bulk of living things known to science. Still, many remain undiscovered. Scientists estimate that millions of species have yet to be found, some of which silently die out, partly due to their habitat disappearing. Even in Singapore, a dense city-state that has lost nearly all of its original forest, discoveries are still being published. As recently as in 2023, a slender cockroach stumbled upon in one of Singapore's oldest nature reserves was named after a Pokemon character, in the case of life imitating art. I'm your host, Ang Ting. In this episode, we'll head over to Windsor Nature Park and talk to the Entomological Network of Singapore, a group of researchers and hobbyists with a shared love for insects. Unlike other public parks, buffer parks like Windsor Nature Park blunt the impact of urban development on the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, where the island's richest native flora and fauna reside. While a stone's throw away from busy roads, blocks of flats, and one of the nation's most famed food havens, Windsor is home to a surprising diversity of bug life, typically found inside the forest. Calling from the trees, the world's loudest insect, the cicada, makes its presence known. Minutes into the walk, we see a tree hugger, not the human kind, but a dragonfly named for its habit of clinging onto tree trunks. Females of this species are light brown, while males are dark blue. Unlike most dragonflies, tree huggers are usually not seen outside the forest because of the way they breed, says Dr. Sean Yap, a forest ecologist studying dung beetles.
As you can see, they rest vertically on tree trunks, which is quite opposed to most dragonflies, which rest horizontally on leaves and other types of softer vegetation. Okay, so the biology of this species is that they breed in ephemeral pools of water. So after a storm, sometimes water collects in the leaf litter and in stumps and tree trunks. So that's where they lay their eggs, and that's where their nymphs develop into adults. So this is in contrast to other species that you find in the ponds outside that have a lot more sun. So those usually breed in standing larger bodies of water like ponds and maybe slow flowing streams. So this particular species is quite restricted into mature secondary forest type of habitat. If you go out to where the pond is near the toilet where we came in from, you won't see this species outside. Yeah, and likewise you won't see the open water body species in this forest as well. Yeah, so there's a very clear distinction between the community of species of dragonflies we find in here versus what we find outside. Yeah.
And why is that the case? Is it because the sort of similar conditions aren't found? Can you actually recreate conditions that mirror inside the forest elsewhere, in urban spaces?
You can. So actually where we are right now is kind of at the edge of the forest. If you look there, you can really kind of see the houses, right? So this is really considered not so-called forest. So it's likely that there is some kind of corridor between the core forest that's inside towards the outside because of planting of native trees, for example, or the retaining of native trees, right? So as long as we have connectivity, provide very similar types of environment, species can move, which is good for them. Yeah, otherwise they'll be restricted to a very small space, and then things like inbreeding depression might be a thing, right?
You mentioned inbreeding. Why is inbreeding a bad thing?
Okay, maybe not so obvious for insects as it would be for larger animals that have a much longer development time, but it reduces genetic diversity. So one example of this that doesn't come from insects, for example, is your bananas, right? So most of the bananas we eat come from a singular genetically identical haplotype, meaning that they all came from one ancestor of bananas that we selectively bred to not have seeds. So wild-type bananas have seeds, and the ones we eat usually don't, or like are soft enough for us to eat. The problem with that is that if there's a disease or blight that affects that particular haplotype, that means that specific banana with the same DNA code across all the bananas we eat, right? It's going to wipe out basically all of them together because they don't have the genetic diversity to resist this kind of disease infection.
A fallen tree reveals another inhabitant of the forest, checkered beetles. It's brunch time for the beetles, which are tucking into organisms that live inside the wood. Not only are checkered beetles native to Singapore, specimens of the species and other beetles found here have made a key contribution to science.
One of the interesting things about checkered beetles as a group is the fact that a lot of the type species, meaning the species that is used to describe the specimens, the type specimens, right? The specimens that were used to describe the entire species, basically the definition of a species itself, right? Are described from Singapore. So most of them were described by an entomologist in the UK based on specimens that Wallace collected from Singapore.
In the 19th century, British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace spent 8 years exploring the Malay archipelago, which lies between Southeast Asia and Australia, and includes the present-day countries of Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. He made several stopovers in Singapore, a British colony at the time, which was the base for his regional operation. Wallace worked quickly to record the island's biodiversity, as he was worried that rampant deforestation would drive its countless interesting insects to extinction. In 1854, after just a few days there, Wallace collected 12 new species of checkered beetles. By the time Wallace returned to London, he had amassed a staggering collection of wildlife specimens, including about 700 species of beetles from Singapore.
Yeah. So Wallace was here for a short amount of time, but he collected a lot of beetles, especially from around the Bukit Timah area. All these specimens were eventually brought back to the UK. Scientists like Westwood and so on and so forth eventually came to his specimens, described species from there. Yeah. So the type specimens for a lot of the species in this group are from here, are from Singapore.
Is it because he was particularly interested in beetles? That's why he collected so many beetles?
Wallace was interested in a lot of different things, but beetles was one of his biggest interests, I would say. Yeah. But yeah, so when I visited Oxford during my PhD to study basically a different group, one of the highlights for me was like finding and seeing the type specimens that were from Singapore that included a lot of these. Yeah.
Deeper in the trail, we bump into another beetle species that thrives in damp and humid conditions. This fungus beetle has an attractive name.
Fungus beetles, there are 2 or 3 main groups, and they all have different common names. So this is a handsome fungus beetle. There are pleasing fungus beetles that are also found on the mushrooms, and there are also shining fungus beetles. So the common name can matter a lot when it comes to the perception of certain species groups. So obviously a name like dung beetle is not particularly inspiring, but for fungus beetles, I suppose partly to separate the different groups and also partly to make them less boring, the scientists have decided to give them a slightly more interesting common name. In fact, like the common joke we have, for example, is that the dragonflies tend to have very, very elaborate and very interesting common names as compared to things like the butterflies. And the joke is that the dragonfly people are trying to outdo the butterfly people in terms of popularity by giving them very fancy names. So you have like ocean glider, crimson dropwing, very poetic names. Yeah.
Other insects that we encounter, like bark lice, have less savoury names. But James Khoo, a member of the network who runs workshops and tours about insects in Singapore, explains why these lice are not as harmful as we think.
So a lot of times they look scary because like a buck lice, certain Socodia, which are related to lice, right? People think that this is scary. They look at that and they're and it happens a lot when like that's scary, right? When you see them move like one big group, they're almost true social insects. They're semi-social insects. when people see such a big group, they're like, oh, is there an infestation? Is there something bad going on? But for most times, bug lice are actually not doing any harm. They're probably just eating like mildew or something on the surface of the leaf, right? And this very, very common relative we see in our homes is the book lice. And it's this tiny black dots or brown dots that you see like sometimes hopping on your walls. So that's an indication of like mildew, mold on your walls, right? And they are eating that. And there have been like some studies or someone, they actually discovered that they eat mosquito eggs. Those book lice actually eat mosquito eggs, a species of that eats mosquito eggs. So the perception of insects and seeing a big swarm can be very daunting, and people always think that that's an infestation, that's bad. But most of the time, actually, a lot of insects are there just doing what they do best, eating. And sometimes it's eating the stuff that's not so good for us.
Given that creepy crawlies are a common trope in horror movies, it almost seems natural for insects to have a bad rep. Unpopular insects like flies and cockroaches are also commonly regarded as pests. In research, such creatures tend to be shunned for more charismatic animals like bees and butterflies, a kind of pretty privilege. But there are some researchers who think otherwise. Fu Maosheng, a curator at the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum, is trying to reform the image of cockroaches and termites. In 2023, he published the discovery of a cockroach species in Singapore with Filipino researcher Christian Lucanas, a fellow Pokemon fan. They chose to name it after a cockroach-like monster from the popular Japanese series, as a homage to their passion. In fact, Maosheng's research into the creatures is driven by the fact that he thinks they are underrated.
Cockroaches, I would say cockroaches are not dirty, right? Because your cockroaches itself, they need to navigate in the environment. They always keep themselves clean, so they're always like preening their antennae to make sure it's clean, free of any dirt, fungi, any sediments that actually can interfere with their sensory organs. So, and in regards to like say cockroaches, right, people always think that cockroaches are like your American cockroach, right? Because they are always found in like near your dustbins, feeding on decomposing stuff. So it gives the idea that they are dirty, and because they are become more of like the vectors of diseases that can actually affect human health. But let's say we're looking at your cockroaches in the forest, they're actually pretty fine. They're actually feeding on like say your fruits, sometimes your seeds, right, as well as your leaf litter. And this in general itself, they don't carry any vectors of diseases. And so cockroaches in general actually very, very clean.
Will you say that it's more of where they are, like the habitat that makes them?
Yes, it does make them itself. So it depends on where they are found. So if they are found near, like say, something that's a very dirty environment, like in the sewage, right? Of course, you don't want to touch them because they are the carriers. But you're definitely found in the forest, like on your leaves or your shrubs, they are fine.
Insects traditionally thought of as pests can play surprising ecological functions. Even the humble fly.
So Maosheng mentioned fly diversity earlier. So flies are, I guess, evolutionarily one of the more recent groups, and they are highly diverse. Basically, for almost any role performed by any other insect in the forest, there's a fly that provides a similar ecosystem function. So robber flies are predators. They feed on, the aerial predators, they feed on flying insects. So they perform a function very, very similar to that of dragonflies. So they snatch flying insects out of the air and they eat them. So they're very good for things like mosquitoes and other flying, well, I'm very careful about the way I use pest species, but like, you know.
Humans in Singapore can also start eating insects since July, after 16 species were approved for consumption. This puts Singapore as part of a global movement to tap insect protein as a more affordable and sustainable human and animal food source. Not all have given the thumbs up to insect eating. Many have responded with disgust online. Some reacted with fear, while others vowed not to eat insects. Like it or not, we are likely to have eaten insects at some point in our life, reveals Maosheng.
Right, and then getting people to know that you probably may have like encountered insects in your food products before also. So like for example, people talk about red velvet cake, right? Where do you get your red pigments? It's actually from the crushed cochineal bugs that's found in Mexico. So in a way, you have been eating insects before. So when people get the idea that it's actually something not say totally novel to the human history. Humans have been eating insects since many ages ago also. So actually in the past also, actually during my trying to create more awareness about edible insects, I actually encountered that there was a newspaper article talking about some Singaporeans actually heading to JB to eat insects. That's because, you know, certain insects like your termites, right, they actually will find on the termite queen saying that they can actually relieve pains and symptoms of arthritis or certain health problems. Yeah.
Interesting.
So having to know that, you know, eating insects is not something new and actually can be more common, right? Maybe that will get people to know that let's try it out. Yeah.
Have you mentioned how insects are just derived crustaceans?
Oh, no, not yet. Yeah. So, yeah, what Sean has mentioned also, right, you know, when you're eating insects, right, it's actually pretty much like eating your terrestrial crustaceans. Yeah. So people always look at, like, say, your crabs and your lobsters or your shrimps, right? Yeah, actually it's like the alternate form for your insects.
So if we had advertised insects, or we advertise insects as land crab snack, maybe people would be more open to eating it? Or is it not quite the same?
Depends, because at the end of the day, it's like whether or not we can eventually have this shift in mentality. So, like, for example, I'm not sure how true this is, but apparently lobsters as a type of food used to be something that poor people, or like, you know, prison food, poor people eat, right? And now it's seen as like some expensive delicacy. So perceptions on things can change given time. The other thing that people tend to target, I don't know whether Mao Sheng mentioned this earlier, is the fact that people, for some reason, who are opposed to eating insects, they tend to feel like they are being forced into a decision that they don't want to make. But in reality, this option of eating insects is just an additional option on top of all the food options are still available to them. It's just whether or not they want to try a new novel food. It's not like we are going to take away all the meat, take away all the seafood, and force people to eat insects, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if they don't want to, it's their freedom of choice.
And I think also want to add on with regards to the lobster story also, right? So yeah, you know, in the past people always think lobsters are like, say, the prisoners' food, right, or food for the poor. But bringing into, like, say, the Singapore context also, right, you know, people are always, like, say, for seafood, you know, one of the go-to choices is always going for the sambal stingray. So it's like in the past itself, sambal stingray is actually not regarded as one of the popular food choices, right? Because people always find, you know, sambal stingray to be very nauseating because of how they are being presented. But after a while, people, they do find ways of like how to properly cook it and then present it, and then it gains popularity and becomes trending, and now it's actually one of the popular, you know, say, maybe let's say more of the gourmet food with regards to the seafood restaurant.
Mao Sheng himself started eating insects since his undergraduate days in 2012.
I have eaten 17 different bug species, right? So it's not just limited to insects, but it also like includes, like, say, your forest scorpion, your zebra tarantula, and your Chinese centipede.
Which do you find the tastiest?
I can't really say which one is the tastiest, right? Because that will also depends on how the edible insects are cooked, right, and how they are seasoned. But when it comes to like insects that are just, you know, you just roast them normally, right, without adding any seasoning, each of them will have a different taste to it. So let's say, you know, when it comes to crickets, right, they tends to be a bit more, have a nutty flavour. Grasshoppers, it tends to be more like, say, some dried vegetables. Right? And then if you're looking at, say, sago worms, right, if they are boiled itself, they have a more coconutty, milky taste to it. But if they are, you know, fried, they have a bit more like, maybe to some extent, people may regard it as like bakwa taste. Yeah. So I wouldn't say I have a favourite to it, but I guess also it looks at, say, you know, which insects are much more easier in chewing. Yeah. For those with a harder skeleton, those are definitely much more harder to chew on, like your adult beetles. So one of the misconceptions, I think, in regards to insects is that, you know, when you eat insects itself, you may find it to be very hard to eat them, right, because of the exoskeleton. But, you know, when it comes to edible insects, there are certain stages that you can actually prefer to eat, but certain stages you prefer not to eat. So, for example, like, say, if you're looking at beetles, right, it's kind of more nutritious to eat your larva form or even the pupae form instead of the adults. Yeah. And the other one is also with regards to, like, say, insects, right? You know, they contain chitin. Well, saying chitin will lead to certain inflammation of the body. But chitin is also not only found in insects, but it's also found in, like, your mushrooms, your crustaceans, like your crabs and your shrimps. Yeah. So if you are fine, you know, eating crabs, shrimps, your shellfish, you should be fine also eating with insects.
Even with regulatory approval, not all insects found anywhere can simply be eaten, explains Mao Sheng.
On this topic of the edible insects, like whether can we eat insects that we find in our forest, this one's a bit hard to say also at times, because we do not know what kind of insects are actually present there, and then what kind of lifestyle they are actually living, and whether that kind of lifestyle will actually affect our diet or our health if we do eat them. So I think that is the reason why SFA has set up one of the requirements. You can't be cultivating or culturing insects from the wild, because you never know what kind of potential parasites they may carry, and then this will actually be passed on from one generation to another. Yeah, sometimes even though the insects may look kind of healthy, but they could be harboring certain parasites itself that may be detrimental to a person's health.
Rather than capturing insects in the wild as food, members of the public could instead capture and submit their findings to the Facebook group Singapore SG ID and Records, or the iNaturalist website.
Anyone can be a citizen scientist. You take a photo of something, you submit it, or you help someone ID something that's contributing to the community of citizen scientists together that are able to fact check each other and basically come together to form this body of knowledge that will be useful for people in the future.
Yeah, so one of the interesting findings that we have on that Facebook group, right, with regards to where we are right now, Windsor Nature Park, right, someone actually discovered that one of the praying mantises that we don't usually have in Singapore, and then we find out that hey, this particular mantis itself, I would call it like say your unicorn mantis, because this particular mantis, the species has a particular horn that's elongated at the top of the head. So this is something that's not usually found in Singapore. With regards to praying mantises, people always think, oh yeah, your praying mantises are usually like big and green in colour, and then they always have the rectangular forelegs. But this species for Singapore records is not only having that horn, but it also is brown in colour.
And while Windsor Nature Park is a friendly haven for insects, thanks to vegetation maintained and planted by the National Parks Board, James hopes people in Singapore could show a bit more love to insects.
I think we talk about city nature now. We talk about the 1 million tree movement. 1 million trees means how many more insects? Have we actually sat down to think if those trees are living and active? 1,000 insects? That's a very low estimate, because these insects will be in your canopy, they'll be on the trunk, on the bark, they'll be in the roots and everything. But as of now, from what I know, there's a significant number of Singaporeans, one beetle flies into your house, they close the door, they call their husband or the spouse or whatever, and hi, I can't go home right now because there's a beetle flying in the house. So we kind of have this disconnect between what we want as a city nature and what culturally and what that means to society, right? So I guess like in a way, insects should figure more in the forefront of like education, in like understanding human-wildlife interactions in such a way that we actually build a relationship with nature through insects. Insects are one of the easiest ways to actually build relationship with nature, right? So I think it's more on that, like to really grow a culture that will be welcoming about insects in our urban environment, in a cohesive, harmonious kind of like civilization in an urban environment, then really has to start with insects and how we build that relationship.
Well, that's a wrap for this episode on the surprising diversity of insects that we can find in Singapore's backyard. We hope you enjoyed Green Trails. I'm Mang Ting. If you'd like to read the articles mentioned in this episode, there are links in our podcast show notes. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.